Alicia Turner sat quietly in the crowded courtroom, the weight of the room pressing down on her. Judge Robert Calloway, with his stern expression, scanned through the papers before him. The air was thick with tension, his gavel ready to fall on another routine case. At least, that's what he thought. Alicia had participated in a protest last month aimed at bringing attention to the unequal access to voting for communities of color. She had peacefully blocked the entrance to a government building, hoping to draw attention to policies she viewed as harmful. The protest had been peaceful, the cause legitimate, but to the judge, it was nothing more than a disruption. Judge Calloway, a man well known for his strict adherence to law and order, wasn't one to entertain the idealistic pleas of activists. He had ruled on similar cases dozens of times before, and Alicia Turner's case seemed no different. As the court reporter tapped away, he addressed her with a cold, impersonal tone. "Miss Turner," he began, "your actions are an affront to the order this courthouse represents. Disrupting the work of the people's government is no small matter. I find you in violation and impose a fine of $1,000 for your actions." The word hung in the air, and Alicia's heart skipped a beat, not because of the fine, but because she knew that this moment, though seemingly small, was part of something much larger. She looked up at the judge, her gaze steady and unwavering. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the fire that burned inside her. "I understand your decision, Your Honor," Alicia replied, her voice clear and composed. "But this fine won't stop the movement. We are not here to be quiet. We are here to make history." Judge Calloway looked at her with a mixture of confusion and impatience. He expected her to protest, to argue for her actions. But instead, Alicia's words were thoughtful, measured, and powerful in their simplicity. He dismissed her statement as idealistic rhetoric, the kind he had heard countless times before. "History," Calloway echoed with a slight smirk. "You're one person. This is just a protest, not a revolution." Alicia's gaze didn't waver. She knew the judge's view was limited, shaped by years of his position on the bench. What he didn't realize was that Alicia Turner wasn't just another protester. She was a strategist, a lawyer, and a leader working behind the scenes to change the fabric of the nation's voting laws. As the bailiff gestured for her to stand, Alicia took a deep breath. "I'll pay the fine," she said, her voice steady. "But I want you to remember one thing. This is bigger than you think. What we're doing will change the law. And soon, no fine or judge will be able to stop it." With that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, the weight of her words trailing behind her. Judge Calloway, unfazed at first, was left alone with his thoughts. Little did he know, he had just encountered a turning point in a battle far bigger than he could have imagined. The news of Alicia Turner's fine didn't fade quietly into the background as Judge Calloway had hoped. Instead, it spread like wildfire across social media and news outlets. Activists, lawyers, and civil rights organizations began to rally around Alicia. A hashtag Alicia for Voting Rights, trended for days, and suddenly, Alicia wasn't just a protester facing a fine. She became a symbol of resistance, change, and the fight for fair voting access. The press coverage painted her as an advocate who was putting her freedom on the line for a cause greater than herself. Her quiet yet bold statement in court reverberated, sparking conversations that reached the highest levels of politics. Alicia, however, remained focused, choosing not to speak to the media. She knew the fine was nothing more than a minor obstacle in a much larger battle. Behind the scenes, Alicia's efforts were far from idle. For years, she had been working with a group of dedicated lawyers, activists, and policy experts to draft and advocate for new federal voting laws. She had personally worked on campaigns to combat voter ID laws that disproportionately affected minority communities, as well as challenges to voter registration restrictions that targeted low-income and elderly voters. Alicia had been the driving force behind the drafting of a bill she believed could revolutionize how voting rights were upheld across the country. Her commitment to the cause was unparalleled. While the nation focused on her fine, Alicia spent her days in meetings, drafting legal documents, and lobbying Congress to push for comprehensive reform. She was working on what could potentially be the most significant overhaul of federal voting laws in decades. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of her case reached the courts as well. Judge Calloway began to receive calls from colleagues and legal experts questioning his decision. They asked if he truly understood the significance of what Alicia was fighting for. Some suggested he should have considered the broader context before imposing the fine. He wasn't used to hearing these kinds of opinions, especially from other judges. They weren't just concerned about the fine itself. They were concerned about whether the law was truly serving justice. Despite his discomfort, Calloway couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Alicia's message echoed in his mind. She wasn't simply disrupting a courtroom or protesting for attention. She was fighting to change something much more entrenched. He had no idea the woman in front of him was already making waves in the corridors of power, waves that would soon reach his own doorstep. In the weeks following the hearing, Alicia's name became synonymous with the fight for justice, and soon she was being invited to speak at rallies and civil rights forums across the country. News outlets began to uncover the truth about her work. She wasn't just an activist. She was one of the architects of a movement to challenge the very foundation of how elections were conducted in the U.S. Alicia's struggle was no longer about one protest. It was about giving a voice to millions who had long been silenced. Judge Calloway, watching from afar, was forced to confront the growing realization. This wasn't just about a protest. This was about a revolution. And he had a front-row seat. As Alicia's story spread, the media began digging deeper into her life, revealing the remarkable journey that had led her to this moment. What the public didn't know was that Alicia Turner wasn't just a protester. She was a force within the legal and political world, quietly working for years to reform the very systems that governed the nation's elections. Alicia was born and raised in a small town in Mississippi, where voting rights had always been a battleground. Her parents, both civil rights activists, had fought tirelessly to ensure that black citizens in their community had a say in their local and state elections. They had experienced firsthand the barriers to voting, poll taxes, literacy tests, and discriminatory gerrymandering that aimed to suppress their voices. Alicia grew up with a strong sense of justice, watching her parents' unrelenting commitment to fighting for what was right. From an early age, she understood that the right to vote was sacred, and that for many, it was still under siege. When Alicia went to law school, she dedicated her career to understanding the intricacies of voting rights law. She became known among her professors for her sharp legal mind and passion for justice. But what set Alicia apart was her determination not to just study the law, but to change it. After law school, she went to work with a nonprofit organization focused on voter rights, where she quickly became a leading advocate for reform. She worked on several landmark cases that challenged discriminatory voting laws in southern states, and her reputation as a fierce advocate for marginalized communities grew. However, Alicia knew that working within the system wasn't enough. The patchwork of state laws and loopholes meant that even when one battle was won, the war wasn't over. So she shifted her focus to a bigger goal: federal reform. Alicia began drafting a bill that would address the root causes of voter suppression: voter ID laws, restrictions on early voting, gerrymandering, and the disenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated individuals. Her vision was bold: a comprehensive set of laws that would protect every American's right to vote, regardless of their race, background, or economic status. Behind the scenes, Alicia was working tirelessly with lawmakers, political strategists, and fellow activists to build support for this sweeping federal reform. Her vision wasn't just about creating laws. It was about transforming the way the country thought about voting. To Alicia, voting wasn't just a right. It was the cornerstone of democracy, and she was determined to ensure that everyone could participate, no matter where they lived or what they looked like. Her activism wasn't limited to legal work. She was a regular presence at protests, rallies, and town halls, speaking to communities directly affected by disenfranchisement. Alicia's grassroots efforts were what ultimately made her case so compelling. She wasn't a faceless lawyer in an office. She was a leader in her community, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had been denied their rights for far too long. In the wake of the fine, more details about Alicia's work emerged, and it became clear that she was not just fighting for her beliefs. She was building a movement. What the public hadn't seen in her quiet resolve during the court hearing was the unstoppable drive that had already begun to change the nation's landscape. As the weeks passed, Alicia Turner's name became synonymous with the fight for voting rights. The ripple effect from her court appearance spread far beyond the courtroom, igniting a firestorm of support across the nation. Her simple but powerful statement in court, that this was bigger than one protest, took on a life of its own. Activists from all over the country rallied around her cause, and the once quiet movement Alicia had been building for years now became a loud national conversation. Her legal team, alongside several advocacy organizations, began organizing protests and public forums, drawing attention to the issues Alicia had been fighting for long before the fine was even imposed. Town halls were held across the country, where voters shared their stories of being silenced by laws that made it harder to vote. What Alicia had been pushing for was no longer abstract legal jargon. It had become a deeply personal issue for millions of Americans who had faced discrimination at the polls. Alicia's efforts were amplified by a coalition of allies from diverse backgrounds. Young activists, seasoned civil rights leaders, and local community organizations all joined forces, rallying behind the idea that voting rights should be protected for all Americans, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. She was now being invited to speak at rallies and policy conferences, where she shared her vision for reform and urged lawmakers to act. Her once modest project to reform federal voting laws had turned into a full-fledged movement. A broad coalition of politicians, including progressive senators and representatives, saw Alicia as a leader. They began to push for the very reforms she had been drafting. Some even cited her work in speeches, recognizing that her contributions had sparked a larger wave of change. Alicia's influence was undeniable, but the movement was far from easy. Opposition came swiftly. Conservative groups, who had long defended restrictive voting laws, began to push back against the proposed reforms. They argued that the changes Alicia and her supporters were advocating for would lead to fraud and corruption. Some criticized the idea of overhauling the voting system, claiming it would destabilize the nation's election process. Despite the opposition, Alicia remained steadfast. She understood the resistance. It was a reflection of the power dynamics she was trying to dismantle. She focused on educating the public about the true nature of voter suppression, using data, personal stories, and legal expertise to demonstrate how these laws disproportionately harmed marginalized communities. Her calm, reasoned approach to the debate won over many who had been unsure about the need for reform. Meanwhile, the pressure was mounting on Judge Calloway. His decision to fine Alicia, once seen as a small and insignificant ruling, had now become a focal point of national discourse. People began questioning whether the judge was truly impartial or if he was, unintentionally, a barrier to justice. Activists were calling for the fine to be overturned, urging Calloway to recognize the far-reaching consequences of his decision. What began as a small courtroom moment was now a national reckoning. Alicia's voice, amplified by the movement she had helped build, was undeniable. The battle for voting rights was no longer just about a protester's fine. It was about a revolution in how America would view and protect its democracy. The movement had found its leader, and the country would never be the same. As the movement continued to gain momentum, Judge Robert Calloway found himself facing a growing wave of scrutiny. What had started as a routine case involving a protester's fine now seemed to be at the heart of something much larger. Calloway, a man known for his conservative views and strict adherence to the letter of the law, was suddenly thrust into the center of a national debate. Alicia Turner's case had become a lightning rod for conversations about voting rights, race, and justice, and Calloway was being forced to reconsider his earlier stance. For the first time in years, Judge Calloway was challenged in a way that made him reflect on his role in the system. The support for Alicia Turner continued to build, And it wasn't just activists or lawyers who were speaking out. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had struggled with voter suppression firsthand, were sharing their stories with the press. The more he read about Alicia's work, the more Calloway began to question the fairness of his decision. He had viewed her as a troublemaker, someone who was simply making the scene. But as he learned more about her efforts to reform federal voting laws, something in his conscience began to shift. The judge began seeking advice from colleagues, some of whom had a different perspective on the case. They encouraged him to look beyond the fine and consider the bigger picture. He spoke with legal experts who explained how voter suppression disproportionately affected minority communities, how these laws had been systematically designed to exclude large swaths of the population from voting. He found himself grappling with the idea that Alicia Turner wasn't simply protesting. She was part of a long-standing struggle to ensure that every citizen's voice counted equally. Calloway's internal conflict grew. He was a man of principle, but his principles were now being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. His actions had already drawn public attention, but he wasn't sure how to respond. A part of him knew that Alicia was right, that the fine was nothing more than a distraction from the larger issue. He also recognized that the legal system was not always impartial, and the very laws he had been enforcing could perpetuate injustice. Finally, after much reflection, Calloway made a decision that would surprise many. He called a press conference, his face grave but resolute. The media gathered as he stepped to the podium, facing the camera with a newfound sense of responsibility. In hindsight, Calloway began, "I see that I made an error in judgment. The fine I imposed on Ms. Turner was not only unjust, it was short-sighted. Alicia Turner is not just a protester. She is a dedicated advocate for voting rights, and her work is leading a much-needed movement for change." His words were met with mixed reactions. Some applauded the judge's willingness to admit his mistake, while others questioned his sincerity. But one thing was clear. Calloway had publicly acknowledged the depth of Alicia's work, and in doing so, he had aligned himself with the larger movement she was leading. For Alicia, the judge's apology was a small but significant victory. It was a sign that even those who had once stood in opposition to her were beginning to see the importance of the fight she had undertaken. And for the movement, it was another indication that the tides of change were beginning to turn. The once isolated fight for voting rights had now gained mainstream recognition, and Alicia Turner had proven that one person's courage could indeed shift the course of history. The shift in Judge Calloway's stance was only the beginning. As the public debate about voting rights continued to escalate, Alicia Turner's case became a pivotal moment in the larger push for reform. Her quiet resolve in the courtroom had evolved into a national conversation, and now it was time for a more formal reckoning. Alicia's legal team had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering momentum for a bold move. They filed an appeal, not only to challenge the fine, but also to make a larger statement about the role of the courts in defending voting rights. The motion to have the fine dismissed became a key moment in the movement, with the implications reaching far beyond Alicia's individual case. It wasn't just about one protester anymore. It was about making a clear declaration that voter suppression would no longer be tolerated. The case was scheduled for a new hearing, and this time, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and spectators. Alicia sat at the front, surrounded by her legal team and supporters who had traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just another legal challenge. It was a chance to shine a light on the broader issue of voting rights that Alicia had been tirelessly fighting for. As Judge Calloway entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. There was a noticeable change in the way he carried himself. He no longer seemed like the hardened judge who had fined Alicia. Now he appeared more thoughtful, more measured. He glanced at Alicia before taking his seat, his expression softened by the weight of the past weeks. The hearing began, and Alicia's lawyer, Michael Jennings, stood to address the court. He spoke passionately about the national movement Alicia had helped ignite, describing how her work had led to real legislative changes in several states. Jennings emphasized the fact that Alicia wasn't just protesting a fine. She was pushing for laws that would fundamentally reshape the American electoral system, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of race or background, had an equal opportunity to vote. Then, Alicia's legal team presented their evidence, statistics, personal testimonies, and legal analyses that demonstrated the profound impact of voter suppression. They highlighted how laws like voter ID requirements, purging voter rolls, and gerrymandering had systematically disenfranchised millions of Americans, particularly in communities of color. The courtroom listened in silence as these stories unfolded, a powerful reminder of why Alicia had been fighting so tirelessly for change. But the most striking moment came when Alicia herself was called to testify. She stood up, facing the judge and the court, her voice calm but filled with the strength of someone who had dedicated her life to this cause. "Your Honor," she began, "this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been turned away from the polls, who has been denied their right to vote because of who they are. This is about ensuring that our democracy represents everyone." Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time, Alicia felt that the people in power were truly listening. Judge Calloway, who had once dismissed her efforts as idealistic, now saw the full scope of her mission. He understood that the fight for voting rights wasn't just a matter of law. It was a matter of justice. The hearing concluded with the judge taking a brief recess to deliberate. When he returned, the courtroom held its breath. Judge Calloway looked at Alicia, then addressed the court with a solemn expression. "I am rescinding the fine," he declared. "But more importantly, I am pledging to take a more active role in supporting reforms that ensure every American's right to vote is protected." The room erupted into applause. And for Alicia, it was a victory not just in the courtroom, but in her ongoing battle to transform the nation's electoral system. This was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for the movement that was continuing to grow with each passing day. The judge's decision to rescind Alicia Turner's fine was more than just a legal victory. It was a significant turning point in the national conversation about voting rights. Alicia's resolve, combined with the widespread support she had garnered, had begun to make even the most conservative figures in the legal and political world reconsider their positions. In the days that followed the hearing, Alicia's phone rang nonstop. Journalists from every major news outlet wanted to interview her. Political figures asked for her support in their legislative battles, and grassroots organizers reached out, eager to collaborate. She had become the face of a movement that was now receiving unprecedented attention at the highest levels of government. Despite the overwhelming media attention, Alicia remained grounded. She had never been in it for fame or recognition. Her focus had always been on the bigger picture, the need to overhaul the nation's voting laws. But now, with the nation watching, she realized that the moment had finally arrived to push her proposed reforms into the spotlight. The momentum was there, and it was time to take action. The first major victory came in the form of a breakthrough bill. Alicia had spent years working alongside legislators to draft comprehensive voting rights reform, and now, with the country's attention fixed on the issue, it seemed that her hard work was paying off. The bill, which aimed to address voter suppression by expanding access to voting, implementing nationwide automatic voter registration, and combating discriminatory gerrymandering, was gaining traction in Congress. Progressive lawmakers were rallying around it, and the bipartisan support was growing stronger by the day. Alicia's efforts in the courts had already shown the power of one person standing up for justice, but now she was shifting her focus to the legislative process. She spent days on the Hill, meeting with senators, congresspeople, and political strategists, advocating for the bill and pushing to ensure that voting rights were protected at the federal level. Her work was methodical, precise, and passionate. She wasn't just pushing for policies. She was advocating for a fundamental shift in how the country viewed the right to vote. As the bill gained momentum, the opposition also grew louder. Conservative groups began to organize against the proposed reforms, citing concerns over election security and fears that the changes would lead to fraud. They mounted an intense campaign to derail the bill. flooding the media with their arguments and putting immense pressure on lawmakers. But Alicia's resolve never wavered. She had seen this kind of resistance before. She had witnessed firsthand the lengths to which people in power would go to protect a system that benefited them, even at the expense of others. And she knew that this battle was far from over. Behind the scenes, Alicia's legal team continued to fight on her behalf, pushing for greater protections for voters in the courts. Activists across the country began organizing rallies in support of the bill, staging demonstrations in front of government buildings and offices of lawmakers who had yet to take a stand. Through it all, Alicia remained a constant presence, speaking with clarity and conviction about the stakes of the fight. Her message was simple: every American deserves an equal voice in the democratic process. The path ahead would be difficult, but Alicia was determined to see it through to the end. The tide was turning. The country was waking up to the fact that the battle for voting rights was far from over, and that Alicia Turner, once just a protester facing a fine, had become the face of a revolution. The days following the passage of the federal voting rights bill were a whirlwind of celebrations, protests, and political maneuvering. Alicia Turner had led the charge, but the victory was never hers alone. It was the result of years of hard work, countless conversations, and the collective efforts of activists, lawyers, and citizens who had united to demand change. And yet, for Alicia, the victory was bittersweet. While the bill was a significant step forward, she knew the fight was far from over. The new law introduced sweeping reforms that made voting more accessible to millions of Americans. It ended discriminatory voter ID laws, established automatic voter registration nationwide, implemented measures to combat voter roll purges, and placed strict regulations on gerrymandering. Alicia's name became synonymous with the law itself, but she was quick to acknowledge that it was only part of the broader, ongoing movement to ensure democracy was truly inclusive for all. As the new law took effect, states began to implement the changes, and the impact was felt almost immediately. Long lines at polling places began to shrink. Communities that had long been disenfranchised saw a dramatic increase in voter turnout, and marginalized groups, especially Black and Latino voters, were finally given the access they had long been denied. The reforms, many of which had seemed impossible just a few years earlier, were now in place. But while Alicia was proud of the progress, she knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. The law was an important victory, but the fight for voting rights would continue, as new challenges and barriers would inevitably arise. The forces that had fought to suppress the vote had not disappeared. They had simply adapted. Alicia continued to work closely with lawmakers, legal experts, and activists to monitor the implementation of the new laws and ensure they were not being undermined or evaded. Judge Calloway, who had once fined her, now became one of her most vocal allies. After his public acknowledgement of his earlier mistake, he continued to support the reforms, using his platform to educate the public on the importance of voting rights. He even began attending rallies, speaking out about the need for ongoing vigilance in the fight for democracy. Alicia and Calloway, once distant figures on opposite sides of the legal system, had become unexpected partners in the movement for justice. But perhaps the most significant shift came in Alicia herself. No longer just a lawyer or activist, she had become a leader in a nationwide movement for justice and equality. Her journey from a protester facing a fine to the architect of one of the most significant voting rights reforms in decades was a testament to the power of determination, courage, and unwavering belief in a cause. As she stood on stage at a rally, surrounded by people who had once been voiceless, Alicia Turner could feel the weight of history on her shoulders. The movement she had sparked was still growing, and while the country had made progress, the work was far from finished. The fight for voting rights was no longer just her fight. It was the fight of an entire generation. And with that, Alicia Turner knew that this was just the beginning. The future of democracy was in the hands of those who dared to challenge the status quo, and she had proven, beyond a doubt, that one person could change the world.